Thank you.
Chair, we're now recording.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Before we start, I just want to read this statement. This meeting is not a formal meeting of the Transport for the North Scrutiny Committee, but is being held as a consultation call by the Chief Executive under the delegated powers of the Chief Executive to take action in consultation with the members of the Scrutiny Committee. Following the consultation call, the Chief Executive will take delegated actions having regard to this consultation. In other words, if we make any decisions, he will follow them out for us. The agenda and reports for the consultation call are being made available to the public, and the call is being live streamed on Transport for the North website to ensure openness and transparency. Members of this committee are all attending virtually. Thank you. I just got to say that this was intended to be a face-to-face meeting. However, about 3 weeks ago, we suddenly had an increase in COVID rates, and I was advised on health and safety grounds that it would be safer to move this meeting to members, please, if you're not on the call, could you please, or you're not speaking, could you please mute yourselves? Thank you. So as I say, this consultation, it wasn't intended to be a consultation call, but health and safety required that I had to change this, and I apologise for that. It is my firm intention at the moment that the next meeting will be face-to-face, and I've instructed the TFN team to make arrangements in that case. Obviously, this will always be subject to health and safety considerations at that time. So as I say, welcome. Please, Gary, could we have any apologies, please?
Sorry, Chair, there's been apologies from Councillor Hughes, Councillor Cushit and Councillor Groves.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else know of any apologies at all? Okay, thank you very much. Now just move to the minutes of the previous meeting. Could I have a proposer and seconder, please?
You just need to do declarations of interest, Chairman, in case there are.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I apologise. Are there any declarations of interest? I take that as a no. Thank you. So minutes of the previous meeting, please. Could I have a proposer and seconder, please? Thank you very much, Councillor Fenton. And the seconder, thank you very much, Mr. Chater. I saw that hand go up. So the first item on the agenda is budget revision update. Mr. Craven, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'm sure members have had opportunity to read the report. We're slightly caught by the timing. The revision 2 that will go to the board on the 24th of November is based on the October actuals. October's our biggest month, or certainly our biggest forecast month. So we've not actually got a firm revision 2 yet. We do have some outstanding accruals from some of the big suppliers as well, which isn't making life any easier. But it does look like we're slightly behind in October, although my team's just currently doing some analysis to work out how much of that is. There's a couple of big one-offs that when they happen, they don't require any resources from within TFN for the activity to take place. So they will almost need to be considered separately. But it does look at the moment like we're slightly behind for October. The question is exactly how much impact that will have through to the end of the year, because certainly the position of the teams at the moment, the key spending teams, is that they're anticipating catching up the 300,000 that were behind the revision 1 at the moment. So that's really the thing that we're wrestling with between now and the board, is exactly what the core position is going to be. But I think even if it's even if it's not bang on where we were before, I think any reforecast is probably not going to move a huge amount. And there is always a question, if you're not going to move your reforecast a huge amount, why bother moving it at all? So we may well end up holding the budget for the revision 2. I think the other thing for members to be mindful of is the MPR position. We were expecting IRP to be announced or published in October around the time of the spending review. As people will be aware, that was already delayed from July and from March previous to that. So there was a piece in the revision 1 that noted the potential impacts on the MPR, the overall levels of MPR activity and therefore expenditure, if the IRP was further delayed. And I think it's likely that the consequences that were set out in Rev 1 will probably come to fruition now, which is that we will end up probably, in the region of 5 million behind the committed budget that was set at the start of the year. But that again is something we just need to get the final numbers out of Network Rail for October, and then just go through with the team exactly where we are and the work that we can do in the absence of an IRP, and some of that's already coming pretty much to fruition. So apologies, I can't be any more precise than that. It just, as I say, timing is not ideal, but I thought it'd probably be worth sharing just some of the things that we're juggling at the moment with the committee.
Thank you, Ian. So, members, we're actually requested to note the financial performance in the 6 months to September. And that's presented to the board. Are there any questions at all? I can see Councillor Salter. Please come in, Councillor Salter.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a quick one, and I don't know how much light our officers really can shed on it, but I'm just interested in the sense of why do we think that the IRP is so delayed? And is there anything that we can do to chivvy that along?
Is Tim Foster on? If he is.
I am in. Let me have a go. I mean, I think we don't have any more information about the integrated rail plan than is in the public domain. So as much as anybody, we are picking up sort of media speculation. But I think it. Sorry, excuse me. I'm just struggling to speak a little bit today. No, we were expecting the integrated rail plan at the spending review. It didn't emerge. The latest position from government, although unofficially, seems to be that it will be published in November, but we just don't know until it comes out. In terms of, is there anything else to do? I know, and again, I think you can see it in the media that particularly board members have been pushing very hard to government to give the clarity about not just about HS2 and about MPR, but actually about the whole of the integrated rail plan. And we may touch on some of this later in the agenda because it affects not only the very, very big investments, but also other enhancements on the rail network that are waiting. So, no, it's a really frustrating time. I think we can say quite convincingly that everything that can be done to encourage government to publish has been done, and we're still now in the hands of government.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Councillor Mitchell, I believe you want to ask a question.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just a query about the verbal talk we had there. We're £5 million behind them. So £5 million behind is an underspend or overspend?
It's an underspend. So the MPR budget was split into two. There was a committed amount which was about 50 million from memory, and there was a contingency amount. Now the contingency amount was really designed for if we got the IRP early, and then we could really crack on. It's a joint co-cliented DFT TFN team arrangement that we've got, but it would have really allowed us to kind of crack on with the work. obviously, as the IRP has been further delayed, the amount of work that the team can do in the absence of some further information about what actually is going to need to be done is declining with each passing month. So whilst the team has been endeavouring to kind of make sure that it gets all the kind of they call it no regrets work, but to avoid nugatory spend, to avoid money being spent on things that then turn out not to being required because of what the IRP says, we're now getting to the end of that work, and therefore increasingly we're becoming, things are slowing up because we're not quite sure what the IRP is going to require. And therefore we're going to end up with an underspend. I think now I can't say at the moment exactly what that will be, but we did a piece of work at Revision 1 just to estimate that what would happen if the RP was delayed beyond October, and we came to the conclusion it would be circa £5 million.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions at all on this item? If there are not, I would like to propose that that we minute that we urge that the IRP documentation is published as soon as possible, so that we add our weight to the main board and other committees up and down the country. Does anybody have any objection to that particular proposal?
I'll second you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So, Gary, if you could note the committee's views on the delay of the IRP, that would be helpful. Okay, then I think Ian, you're back on again with business process planning, please.
Yeah, and there may be some retreading here as well, Chair. Unfortunately, the document really sets out the process that we're following. The situation we find ourselves in at the moment, and we have no funding settlement for next year. So there are really three things that we need in order to get the business planning going properly. The first is a core funding settlement. The second is the IRP to come out, and the third is flowing down from the IRP coming out is an NPR budget. The discussions that we've had with the department at the moment, and we are pushing quite firmly in terms of trying to get more information out earlier, because this is starting to cause an issue on the business planning side. But the indications that we have is that we're unlikely to get a funding settlement much before back end of December, beginning of January, which is as it was last year. And the reason for that is that we are simply, part of a very small part of government spending, decision making, DFT business planning, and we are really just a taker of a process that is obviously dealing with much bigger numbers than the ones that TFN is dealing with. What that means is that it's very difficult to do any genuine business planning in the absence of any funding, and also the absence of any real clues as to what's in the IRP. So what we're doing at the moment is similar to what we did last year, which is we're essentially following a prioritisation process. So the teams are already working on prioritisation based on the document that was taken through board that set out what we wanted in the spending review submission, but also other decisions that the board has made over the last 6, 12, 15 months, which include things like the Northern Transport Charter and the various policy documents around things like decarbonisation that the board has approved as well. So we're not kind of just sitting around waiting for something to drop from the department. We are actively business planning at the moment to try and come up with the priorities and really to try and get us into a position where when we do have a funding settlement, we're able to reasonably quickly get to a point where we can produce a fundable business plan, and therefore we can create a budget before the March board when it needs to be approved. I don't know, Tim, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think only I think in terms of sort of particularly policy and strategy development work for the next financial year that and indeed subsequent years will be work that we discussed at this committee sort of previously, particularly around the new strategic transport plan. And again, we're now, having sort of taken the programme to the board, we're now looking at the sort of more detailed approach and what we need to do, but actually understanding the detail and our capacity to produce a new strategic transport plan which is ambitious and wide-ranging as both officers and the board would like it to be, will depend an awful lot on our settlement. So as Ian said, we're doing what we can to plan. We can see the big sort of elements of work that are coming down the track and how we sequence those. But actually, the later the budget settlement goes, the more challenging it gets to then programme all of that in a coherent way before the start of the financial year. So I think that's the risk for us at this point.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ian. Does anybody have any questions at all for Ian or Tim? I have one question for you, Ian. How much is it costing us in terms of lost time? I mean, presumably, although people are following this prioritization process, we are in essence not quite twiddling our thumbs. But so, how much money would you say we're losing every week as a consequence? And how much overtime is going to be required if when we get this in order to get the plan finished?
I don't think we're losing any time particularly. I think there's a relatively small number of people involved in the business planning, and we're kind of going through exercise that they need to go through in any case at some point. I think the teams are busy. I don't think at the moment there's because the funding for this year and the budget for this year is set. I don't think there's anything related to next year's business planning process that is meaning that people are slowing down just yet. Whether that is still the case if we start getting into late December, January becomes a different matter, Paul. I think so. It's something that I don't think is causing us an issue now, but has the potential to certainly. The later this arrives, particularly the IRP, the more potential it has to essentially throw sand into the works in the final quarter.
Okay, thank you for that, Ian. Councillor Davison.
It's not so much a question, Chair, as an observation, really. I mean, this is all very depressing, isn't it? I have to say, and it's up for you guys to carry on, really, not knowing where on earth the future's going to lie. I think, from a committee point of view, I think we should be lodging our disappointment. The government have committed to levelling up the north. We've got this issue going on where we don't know really what the hell the shape of the railway is going to be across the country, really, but in the north. We don't know what the eastern leg of HS2 is going to look like, whether it's going to be cancelled. I've seen a report where they're talking about using existing lines. Now, the whole purpose of HS2 is a recognition that existing lines, the geometry of the track, basically prevents any high speed. And of course, that we all know that the principal reason behind the whole thing is to get passenger and freight separated. So this leads on to the bigger picture of getting freight off the road onto rail and intermodal. So it's an enormous repercussion, and I think the basic thing we've got to do is express our disappointment, request clarity on HS2, and as I think has been said before, get this stuff underway, because at the moment we just seem to be spending a lot of money producing reports that might be totally invalid. So it's an observation, but I think we should really be lobbying very hard to get clarity as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Davison. I shall note that at the end in my summing up at the end. Councillor Chater.
Councillor Davison has been saying a lot of what I was concerned about, and I sent you the email, Chair. The big problem is we need to have this certainty, because we're trying to deliver a decarbonised agenda. There's a massive achievement already occurred on the South Bank, in Councillor Davison's area and the other area. They've now started shifting freight in large quantities by rail. It's taking 80 lorries per day off the road And that's just with a diesel, not with an electrified train, which would be taking yet more out of the carbon footprint of the country. Absolutely spot on. We're looking in terms also at what is going to happen with relation to HST. If we're going to have a properly joined up system that delivers, if they were going to do it using the East Coast Main Line, they should have started doing that some time ago, and they could have been nearly complete with it. But they decided they want to do HS2. I'm not criticising. They want to go for a modal shift, and they want to get people to start using trains. But if you're going to do that, as has been said, you have to bring it to both sides of the Pennines. You have to bring it into Sheffield and Leeds. And from there, you've got to then put the links in that take passengers to the north, to Newcastle, to Middlesbrough, to all the other places that are in the desperate need of connectivity. If we don't do that, it doesn't work. If we're trying to get people off the road, great what's already been done by the rail companies on the South Bank, but we've got to do that, and we've got to have the electrification of the line to the South Bank and to Hull from Doncaster, and the connections to the north when it comes to feeding into the Selby connection. We need to get this reiterated and government to be pushing it forward, because if we don't, it all grinds to a halt. You look at the motorways on a bad day and it is still no better, it's getting worse and worse by the day. The amount of goods traffic that's on there. We need to get that freight onto rail, as has already been started on the South Bank, and we need to get more and more of this on the north, and to carry it through the entire north of England, because there is this issue. So much goes by road, so much goes onto the A1, so much goes onto the A19. We need to be getting traffic off those roads and getting the freight and passengers onto rail. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Chater. I'm hoping that I will capture your comments and Councillor Davison and hopefully the rest of the committee in. Gary, I would like us to note.
Every confidence in you doing it.
Oh, thank you very much, Sean. I'd like us to note that that this committee is concerned that our planning is being hampered by the delay in the core funding arrangements, the IRP, and consequently the NRP. So the word hampering there. At the moment, our officers are carrying out an interim prioritisation process, but by the time we get to December, we will be seeing significant costs from the lack of detailed settlement from the government. Additionally, we require a level of certainty in order to be able to carry out our duty as to improving transport for the north and a decarbonisation policy that involves modal shift from the roads to rail or to alternative transport. Does that sort of more or less capture our thoughts, committee? If anybody would say whether they object to what I've sort of tried to get down there.
Sounds good to me.
Okay then. Look, Gary, if you could note that's how the committee feel about this, that we need these as a matter of urgency in order to support our officers, etc.
Yeah, Chair, I've noted that.
Thank you very much. Councillor Chater actually brought up. Sorry, Councillor Parish, do you have a question?
Yeah, it was. That's fine. What you just said. I think it was just an aside about the increase of traffic on motorways. I hope it's temporary, but I don't think we're going to get people back on public transport in great numbers until the government reintroduces compulsory masking.
Thank you. Councillor Chase brought up freight and logistics, and today we can bring you a freight and logistics expert. She's going to, I believe, introduce a few different concepts and ideas. However, she's here for you to ask questions of in the main. So I'd like to hand over to Maggie Simpson. If you would like to perhaps talk to us, Maggie. Thank you. There you are. I can see you now.
Hello there. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me along today. I've only got a very few words of introduction, and then really it's over to you for any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to ask me about. I can do my best to field those questions, or if I can't field them, then we can follow some of those up later with either myself or with TFN colleagues. So, as I've joined the call there, I can see that you are already talking about freight logistics and its importance to the north of England. So, you don't need me to remind you of that, but let me just open by sort of saying logistics is a global activity, and I think what we've seen in the press in recent weeks about freight logistics reminds us of that. The port of Long Beach is ground to a halt in the States. Felixstowe has had its usual issues of port congestion. Ports around the world are feeling the pinch. And of course, supply chains are global, and within the UK as well, supply chains are often national. Businesses operate across all the regions of the UK. But of course, north of England is hugely important in that network, whether that's local, or nationwide or global. In fact, it's hugely important. Why? Well, firstly, as a consumer of goods, I did a quick add up yesterday, something like 6.5 million households in the region who all eat, buy, do Christmas shopping. And then, of course, there's 1 million businesses who also consume with, whatever it is that they need, either as services, industries, or indeed manufacturing. And so my second point, of course, north of England is a generator of goods through the industry that it has, the manufacturing industry that it has, and, of course, those businesses who are exporters across the region. And finally, of course, the north of England is a gateway through the ports and airports that it has. Gateways both for imports and exports, and again bringing us back to the point that freight logistics is both national, local and indeed global in its reach. The region's exporters, I'm sure, sending goods around the world. So the points that I just sort of wanted to open with really was this. Firstly, you are as committed as we are to rebalancing the economy, to growing the economy of the north of England, and if you grow the economy, history would suggest you will increase the demand for freight movement. They come hand in hand, and therefore you're going to need to have infrastructure and systems to support the growth in freight movement, along with all the other passenger movements and transport needs that the region has. Secondly, I think we've seen already, and there continues to be a really vital role, therefore, for Transport for the North in helping to promote and support and deliver those networks that freight transport needs. It is, of course, very different to the passenger network in that the providers are not owned or concessioned or contracted by parties around the table here today. But there's nonetheless a very big role for TfN in influencing freight and supporting the needs of the region in freight distribution. In terms of the infrastructure, I've already heard some comments from the people who were speaking as I joined the call, which, I'd fully support around that. Remembering that the infrastructure demands, of course, there are local and very specific infrastructure demands, which you'll all understand better than I do. But on a sort of structural level, both the north-south connectivity and the east-west connectivity is really important across to and from the region. East-west, obviously, a huge focus on Transpennine route upgrade for us in freight, perhaps also Northern Powerhouse Rail when the details of that come out. And north-south, obviously, the big trunk routes, the West Coast Main Line, the East Coast Main Line, the capacity challenges that we're expecting on that. And, of course, freight and logistics isn't only about consumer goods, it's also about bulk products. The region has, within it, the Peak District Quarry Cluster, and the Hope Valley Railway Line is a hugely important access for that cluster as well. And, of course, underlying that, what is driving businesses to want to use more rail is, of course, several things, but big amongst them is decarbonisation. So how can we support decarbonisation of freight logistics across the region through supporting action, obviously, from business, but around that infrastructure question as well. So they were really my opening remarks, but, I'm very happy to take questions on anything, really. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. We're only going to ask you questions about freight and logistics. We're not going to ask you about what goes on with the A1 or in terms of Morris Minors or other vehicles.
You can ask me, but you won't get an answer.
So, well, I want to try and keep it fairly targeted. Your time is precious, so thank you very much for joining us. I do have a question which I might want to pick up with. To start off, just while others are thinking of questions, my big concern, and I actually probably a bit of a broken record on this. I very much believe in statistics, numbers, and key measures. So, for example, we can fight over whether it's 90 or 93% of freight travels by road. But if we actually turn around and said, right, we've got a decarbonisation plan that says by 2050, we're going to be net zero. As part and parcel of that, how much of our freight in the north of England needs to be going by rail or by alternative transport by then? And maybe that's the start point. You ask, what's the target? And therefore, how do we create interim targets? So do we want to, how much freight do we need to get off the road, and B, how much are we actually capable of? So I'm actually very keen on some of the numbers. One of the things that bothers me, and Lucy, I don't think is on the call today, but if she were, she'd recognise this question, is we're continually told that the gauge isn't right. Well, I'd like to know how many bridges we need to knock down in order to improve that. And again, it's a stat, because if we know there's 20 bridges, we know that's quite a long way to do. But we don't know that level of detail. They say it's difficult because the gauge changes. Does it change 20 times? Does it change once? And really what I'm trying to get at is, how do we get people to think more in what are the true statistics behind this? And then we can look that way. We get a way of looking at what I would call the low hanging fruit. Anyway, that's sort of my question, is really just all around measures and targets.
Okay. Yes. So thank you. So, I mean, I'm going to start with an off-colour remark, because I had an English teacher many years ago. I can get away with it because I'm a woman. And he said to me that statistics were like a bikini, because what they reveal is interesting and what they hide is vital. And I think there's always a bit of a danger of that. So forgive me the off-colour remark. But in terms of that modal shift statistic, I think what's really interesting is to think about how we stack up in different commodity markets. So I know, for example, that today we move more than a third of the goods that come out of Felixstowe and similarly out of Southampton by rail. But we do not move anywhere nearly as big a proportion of that from some of the other regional ports. So Teesport, Liverpool, even London Gateway is probably at the 10 to 20% statistic. Now, I don't have actually those statistics, but we could get them, I'm sure, for the regional port. Lucy, frankly, probably has them off pat anyway. So at one level, there is an easy question, which is how can we get, just picking on ports, other ports to have the same market share as Felixstowe and Southampton. When we talk about construction materials, I know that, we are moving about 40% of the stone and cement into London and the South East by rail. And I know that number is rising significantly for traffic into Birmingham as a consequence of HS2, and that I've got members who are pushing very hard to get that number higher for Manchester and Leeds and other major conurbations. Again, I haven't got the numbers off the top of my head, I'm sure Lucy has, but there are parts of the freight market where rail has a very significantly greater market share than the average would suggest. And I think it's worth understanding more about that, because obviously there are some parts of the freight market that we're never going to touch, and that would be delivery to store or to front door. So breaking it down a little bit is important. In terms of growth potential, Network Rail have done a lot of work on that. That work is available, and I am expecting that Great British Railways, as it gets going, will do more work on that, not least to inform the freight growth target, which government is going to set on GBR. So I think there is an opportunity for more work around that and the regional breakdown of that as well. In terms of gauge clearance, I think actually the answer to some of your question does exist on the key corridors that are top of the list for that gauge clearance. So on the Transpennine route upgrade, which is the most important axis for us at the moment, My colleagues tell me that between Manchester and Leeds there are only 3 structures, only 2 of which are difficult, and that between Leeds and the East Coast and Manchester and the West Coast, again I haven't got the number, but they know it is a handful of very small interventions which are usually around the edges of platforms or canopies. I'm not sure, I can check the numbers, but there are not believed to be any showstoppers. And the work at Yarm is underway. It is proving more difficult than anybody thought, but that is underway, which gives the other route out from Teesport to the East Coast Main Line. So I think on Gauge there is already a lot more information available. I am told we are making progress on TRU and getting that formalised into the work, although I'm not certain this is over the line yet. Good progress in the last few months on getting the granularity of detail on that particular corridor.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Davison will probably have a much better question than mine, so over to you, Councillor Davison.
Really, it's looking at utopia, if you like, and you've discussed a lot of the things that need doing and are going on, but I think the reliance we have on road haulage, HGVs, which feeds into all the problems we have with decarbonisation, is really, you can trace it right back to beaching, can't you? And the lack of investment, the shift to road was deliberate. We're now trying to reverse that shift, and it's not easy because obviously we've got loads of routes that can't cope with the largest of the containers. Work's been done on gauge enhancement, and there's a lot more to be done, but ultimately, if you look at utopia, where we think we need to be, we need to look at the vast majority of freight coming into our ports, going onto rail, straight off the containers that come off the ships, the largest boxes going straight onto rail wagons and through the infrastructure. Far more intermodal facilities. There are a number already, that ABP and the likes operate, but there aren't enough. And then the utopia, of course, is that most of that is shipped across the country, not just the north, but the whole country, goes on rail, is transferred then onto basically electric vehicles, hopefully in the future, for your local distribution, and that's food. I mean, Tesco's and what have you, a lot have invested in rail facilities already for that, but there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, the statistics that you've mentioned, Paul, show that we're years behind, anywhere near that utopia, aren't we? So I think the challenge for transport for the north and the country as a whole really is how can we accelerate that investment, that vision materialises. We've got some new free ports coming online. Luckily, Immingham, we've had the gauge enhancement there, but we need to electrify it. And obviously, those that can't be electrified, are we really supporting the conversion of the locomotives that are used by the freight haulage companies into hydrogen? Where are we on that path, to decarbonise that? Because not every line will be electrified. There are money and logistics. So we need to see where we are with locomotives. I mean, the same's going for the debate on HGVs and where we're going with that as well. But it's equally important, I think, and for air travel as well, air freight. But so it's not a question really, but I mean, it's the challenge is that, how are we as Transport for the North going to, push to get that goal achieved? Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Davison. Sorry, Lucy, can I ask Councillor Chater to come in, and then I've got Councillor Salter, and then perhaps you've got a series of things, because a lot of what Councillor Davison said was actually sort of, I suppose, reflections on the challenge. So, and I'm suspecting that the others will be as well. So over to you, Councillor Chater.
Thanks, Chair. Maggie, this one of the things that strikes me is that if we're going to try to get as much off the road and onto rail, we may have to reactivate some of the old lines that were beaching, as it might be put. The point that Councillor Davison makes is a very, very well made point with relation to getting as much freight as we can. We've had the announcements of the free ports made by the Chancellor last week. The Humber area The 4 ports in the area are tied in, but 3 of them are actually parts of the Freeport. That will be Goole, that will be Immingham, and that's part of Hull tied into Headon. But what we need, obviously, is to be getting the freight onto the networks and getting it through. One of the problems we seem to have, and it's been said before, is that when freight goes from Hull or from the South Bank ports and it's trying to go to Manchester, it's going south of Birmingham to go there. Now, there's been a suggestion made on more than one occasion, and government have put forward a small amount of money, small in the global scheme of things. To any of us, it's sizable, 50,000 quid. But in the global scheme of things, if we're looking in terms of reinstating, for example, the line between Beverley and York, which would feed from the Hull to Scarborough line, that would allow us to carry more rail freight from Hull docks to the north and then to transport it to points north without having to go through this, having to go to the south of England before we actually start to go north. Where do you think we stand with regard to this? Because clearly that's going to be a major issue when it comes to how do we get the modal shift. If your freight's been stuck going down south of Birmingham and there's no alternative, will you want to be doing that, or would you want to be sticking on the back of a lorry and sending it up the A1 or the A19?
Thank you very much, Councillor Chater. Councillor Salter, if you'd like to bring your question to the table as well, and Lucy, I can see, is making lots of notes.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, very briefly, I mentioned this at the September meeting, but I'm interested in obviously the thoughts now. So I think as part of the shift from road to rail, I think we need to consider small and medium-sized businesses and how accessible freight is for them as an option to move goods around and whatever. So I just sort of wanted a very quick thought on how could we make that easier, how can that be made more feasible?
Thank you very much. Over to you, Maggie.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a lot in there. I mean, I suppose a macro point is around what, how the market for freight works. And let me just answer that first, because I think it cuts across all 3 questions. And what we've got, obviously, is a publicly provided infrastructure and private organisations using it. And there is a question about making sure that it is cost effective for private businesses to use rail, i.e. making sure that the price of using rail is effective. And that is a key part of our thinking on everything, whether that's investment in terminals or locomotives or anything else, making sure that it remains cost effective for the market. And of course, this is a moving feast, as road haulier prices are rising significantly at the moment, as we know, so that things move in that dynamic, but cost effectiveness is really important. But let me just take a few of those points in turn. Hydrogen locomotives, I believe there is one being prototyped in America at the moment. The research that has been done in the UK, bearing in mind the constraints of the UK network, suggests that it would be quite difficult to have a hydrogen locomotive today that would have anywhere close to the power output that you need for hauling freight, and that's been validated by plenty of people independently. That doesn't mean that in future there won't be one, but it means that if you went out to buy one today, the technology simply doesn't exist in the quality that you would need for the power output that you would need to do a full-length commercially viable freight train. So where I'm interested at the moment for the role of hydrogen is in what we can do in terminals, shunting, port handling equipment, areas like that. I think there are obviously places like the Tees, which are hydrogen centres of excellence, where hydrogen will be available. More generally, I'm yet to understand how hydrogen distribution across the country is going to work, whether green hydrogen will be available at the scale needed, or whether it will be allocated for home heating or other matters. So I think there are opportunities, there are also questions around that. But you're absolutely right that we will have to have a solution for the last mile. At the moment, we have members using things like hydrolyzed vegetable oil, trialling that. and most of that is earmarked for the airlines in the fullness of time, but maybe there are opportunities around things like that as the technology develops. I don't know, but it's an area we're keeping a very close eye on. Reopening of old lines, I'm afraid my geography isn't up to commenting on the specific routes that Councillor Chater mentioned. Generally, it tends to make me a little nervous, if I'm honest, when the answer for freight is to route it on a line that doesn't yet exist, because we see that too often. And I believe that the answer right now is making capacity for freight on the lines that do exist through a fair allocation of capacity on those corridors. And the TransPennine is key to that for us. If we can get the hourly pass across the Pennines as part of the TransPennine route upgrade, that will open up Hull and Liverpool and Tees and Immingham for routes into Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, and indeed connectivity right across that east-west axis. That doesn't mean that there aren't situations where reopening old lines or indeed building new lines has a place. It does. The trick, I think, with that is making sure that where those lines connect back into the existing network, we haven't just moved a capacity constraint down the line by 10 miles. So we have to look at what the end-to-end route would look like with that reopened line in place. And then in terms of getting a wider range of businesses onto rail, I think there are a number of challenges around businesses who only have a small number of consignments. There are already train operators who work with businesses like that in terms of consolidating loads on rail. So if you have a single container loader support, there are some services you can get into, but it is a challenge because the economics of rail freight work when we have a train load. I think there are a number of things that are key to that. One is having the right terminals and interchanges in the right place, and I know the draft TfN strategy talks about the need for more rail freight interchanges in the north of England, and we'd certainly support that. It is under-resourced as a region, I would say, compared to other parts of the UK for that. Not as bad as London and the South East where there aren't any, but certainly compared to the Midlands and Scotland. Getting warehousing next to railheads, getting manufacturing next to railheads helps you with the efficiency and cost of that. But ultimately, we will need to think about how the freight operators or their partners broker train loads. And what's been interesting for me is seeing businesses like Maritime Transport, who've taken over DB Cargo's estate at Trafford Park. What they do is they move goods for a whole host of different companies, and actually what they do is aggregate a train load. So that doesn't completely, I appreciate, answer the SME question, but I acknowledge the gap and the steps that are trying to be taken to close it.
Maggie, thank you very much for a very comprehensive answer. I've got two questioners left, and you'll just have two questions, and then we'll let you go. So, Councillor Parish, please ask your question.
Yes, Chair. It's just a cautionary tale, really. I was watching Michael Portillo on the West Highland line last week, and he kept mentioning that the timber trains had stopped running. He didn't explain that his Prime Minister had actually ordered that all the trains on a route should bear a fair share of the fixed costs. And the timber trains had actually been priced on making a marginal profit on top of fuel and train crews and a small contribution to fixed costs. But once they had to bear a fair share, they were no longer competitive and the timber went by road, and the remaining passenger services then bore all the fixed costs and lost even more money. So in terms of doing a business plan for new lines or whatever, I think you do have to take into account how the services are going to be priced for freight.
Thank you very much, Councillor Parish. Councillor Chater, you've got another question, I believe, or another observation.
And it's a quick one, Chairman. Thank you. Are there any lessons we can learn from what happened with Freightliner in the past? Because we had that in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s.
So, Maggie, back to you. And as I say, those are your last two questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, point on pricing well made. The framework for access pricing is changed in 2016 and is well established in law. We are very nervous about the plans in rail reform to change the law and indeed to exclude Great British Railways from large parts of the law. And that is making a lot of my members very nervous about what might happen on pricing, but the point is well made. More positively, there were some good trials with timber in Scotland the year before lockdown, which several of my members were working on, and I believe there is good progress being made towards getting those trials onto a not necessarily permanent footing, but certainly a much longer extended period of trial to try and make that case there. So timber hasn't been given up on completely. And then Freightliner, I'm afraid my history isn't up to knowing precisely where the issues that Councillor Chater raised with Freightliner in the past were, so forgive me on that. But I think what I would say is that, intermodal as a sector is very buoyant at the moment. We were down at the multimodal trade show just a couple of weeks ago, and I think in that week alone we saw the launch of the second daily service from Liverpool this autumn. The Humber Express trial goes live this week. I believe there are a couple of trains running for a famous fizzy drinks company starting soon. There are 2 new Tesco services which are due to start imminently, and colleagues of mine who run up the West Coast Main Line from the Midlands are trying to run additional trains to support the Christmas flows. So intermodal is a very positive place to be at the moment, notwithstanding all the comments made previously around the challenges.
Maggie, thank you very much. You are our first expert that we've called to in the time that I've been on this committee, and it's something that we're looking to do in future. So I'd like to thank you for coming, and we will learn to give better briefings and more thorough briefings in future. But as I say, this is just the first time we've done this. One of the reasons behind this is we've got an eminently professional officer, Lucy Hudson, who gives us lots of detail and is very popular with the committee in terms of giving us lots of information. But the idea of calling on experts is not just so that we understand some of the issues more, but it actually helps inform what our opinions are on papers that say, for example, in this case, Lucy might present to us. So I think as a committee, I hope we will all thank you for your presentation and your comments and feedback today. What I take away from this really is that we're looking for, despite Councillor Davison's utopian future, we're really looking for practical routes to achieve rapid change by a number of small and big interventions that actually will expedite us being able to use. I think in software terms they talk about vaporware. I'm not sure what you call railway lines that don't exist, but it actually uses what we've got. And those sort of comments that could be given to say to fed back into Lucy, into TFM, would be really helpful for us. So as I say, I won't say you're a guinea pig or an experiment, but you are the very first, and so you're a trailblazer. So thank you very much for coming today, Maggie.
No problem. So my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Chair, could I just ask very briefly if it's possible that when Lucy puts some more information together, we get a briefing note, only 1 or 2 sides, on what happened with Freightliner and its positives and negatives. We had negatives in the Hull area, and I'm just thinking about where we can look at this, because if we're looking at modal shift, and part of what was being raised by our colleague earlier with regard to getting small quantities of goods carried in a small container, it might be something that could assist us.
Okay, Gary, if you could make a note of that, I'd be grateful, and as would the committee. Councillor Davison.
Yeah, I think from my memory, Freightliner, what they used to do, they would visit small manufacturers or businesses that had a rail link and collect one container of goods from them, and then they would create a full-size train from that. Now, when the freight business was privatised into, well, umpteen companies now. Everybody jumping on the bandwagon after EWMS lost their monopoly. That service was reduced, but I think that seems, from what you were saying there, Maggie, that seems to have come back a little bit now.
So they have a division called Logico. I'm not sure that it operates from everywhere, but that's exactly what Logico do. They are, a box-by-box business, and GB Rail Freight operate. I mean, they don't have the nationwide coverage that Freightliner do, but they certainly operate. They'll take containers from individual businesses or park train loads. Freightliner still do have a road fleet under the Pentalva brand, but obviously, collection and delivery is a different matter into the terminals. But I'm sure Lucy would be able to tell you a bit more about what they do and what the intermodal market is looking like if that was of interest.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Thank you very much, Councillor Davison. I've asked Gary to note that, and we will ask that information. I really need to move on to another topic that's close to our heart, which is the Manchester Recovery Task Force, and I believe we've got David Hogarth to tell us all about this today.
Thanks, Chair, and morning to everyone. I've got a couple of colleagues here with me that I may call on for questions if needed, but I'm going to give you a short overview of the paper. It will only be short. Essentially, the problem here is the piece of infrastructure in Manchester that's one of only a handful in the country that's been declared congested infrastructure on the Castlefield corridor, and that really limits and caps the number of trains that can be reliably run down that corridor. So the solution is a major piece of investment, and it's in the rail network enhancements programme. It's being worked on, but it's going to take several years to fully deliver. So a short-term plan is needed to relieve the problems of congestion that were very apparent, particularly before the COVID pandemic changed the pattern of services and the usage. So the report provides an update on progress on that short-term timetable, which is targeted at December next year, and also critically on the collaboration on developing a rail map for future investment and service changes. So on the December 22 timetable, there were three options consulted on, you'll be aware, earlier in the year, and a report has recently been published jointly by ourselves, Network Rail, and the Department for Transport, setting out the outcome of that consultation. And there's a revised proposal called B+, so building on the option B, but slightly different, that sets out the broad structure of services that is planned. Now, in particular, you'll be aware of a lot of discussions going on over the summer through Rail North Committee, which has been the TfN body that's overseen all this work. They've pushed really, really strongly to improve the cross-Warrington linkages and to retain some Sheffield to Manchester airport services in particular, as well as other aspects of the timetable. And that's now reflected in the proposal that the task force, the industry group that has overseen this work, has put forward. And that broad structure, as I say, is now published. That is available to see. It's included in the report, the link. And the next step will be for the train operators to do a further round of consultation on the detail of that, so the calling patterns and the exact timings, although the structure itself is now set. As I mentioned earlier, the key other thing that the Rail North Committee members have been discussing and debating with industry and the Department for Transport over the summer months is to have a very clear rail map of how we exit and develop the December 22 timetable, recognising that it is a compromise, and it compromises on connectivity essentially in favour of improving performance, which is obviously needed in the short term. So the idea of the rail map is it will provide some very clear opportunities to develop services that is either linked to service changes that might be happening in the future or infrastructure. And in some cases it's infrastructure that's already been approved, like the Wigan to Bolton electrification will provide opportunities to improve services on that corridor, but it's also the case that it's the bigger interventions, things like Oxford Road Station that are under development. When they come online, there'll be another opportunity to improve things there. And the idea of the rail map is to map this out so there's a clear process, and saying that the December 22 timetable is a staging point. It is not what we want to end up with. It's a starting point that gives us better reliability, and the rail map sets out how we build back from there and link the infrastructure investment with service improvements. So the next steps on this are The detailed consultation will commence within about the next 2 weeks. So the industry is just finalising the details of those timetables. It goes out to full public consultation. So all local authorities, for example, will be able to respond to the detail of that. The outcome of that will again be reported to Rail North Committee, and the industry will then make any final adjustments and move to implementation of that timetable in just over a year's time. Obviously, TfN and the Rail North Committee will be very carefully monitoring the preparation for that and delivery of that. It requires some smaller bits of infrastructure to support it, like longer platforms, etc. So the committee will keep an overview of that. So that's all I want to say in terms of introducing the report, Chair, and obviously happy to take questions and bring my colleagues in if needed.
Thank you very much, David. I believe Councillor Parish has the first question. His hand was up very rapidly. You hadn't been on the screen for more than a minute.
Because I knew what I was going to say, Chair. Chair, this is partly parochial, and I'll declare the interest that the new Warrington West station, well, it's 2 years old now, is in my ward. But the stitch up there could be a lesson for anywhere wanting a new station or even a line restored. As a preamble, can I say this as a teenager in the 1960s? I actually had an article published in the Manchester Evening News about how Oxford Road Station could cope with the trains displaced from Manchester Central when it closed. In terms of the current proposals, Warrington thankfully has kept the through local service from Manchester to Liverpool. But we're getting this proposed TPE service from Cleethorpes diverted from the airport to Liverpool, and that will not include the stop at Warrington West because it said it will need 20 minutes turnaround time at Lime Street to recover from any delays, which sounds like a counsel of despair to start with. The current Northern Express service to the airport managed with 13 minutes, so effectively we're getting a TPE service that's more likely to run late, simply because of where it comes from. And because of that change, a new station that's cost £20 million of public money is going to get fewer trains calling than in the business plan or in franchise bids. The point is made by the Manchester Recovery team, but the problem is not the corridor itself, but late running of trains before they get there. Thus, the claim that in there the Cheshire Lines route through Warrington performs badly in terms of delays, it's a bit odd when it's because of delays elsewhere. So with the Northern Airport service, it was better, but we're now getting instead another service more likely to be delayed and delay the local services. But if anybody has the actual indicative timetables before they actually go live, that would be useful, but there does seem a bit of reluctance to publish them. But anyway, the main lesson for everybody, I think, is that before spending millions on a new station, get some guarantees that trains are actually going to call there.
Okay, could you provide an answer, please, on that one, and then I'll call in Councillor Jones, who no doubt has a question at the other end of this particular line.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is we understand the compromises here. I think in terms of delays, it's across a wide area. There's no one line that causes the delays in particular. The task force, we're confident, have looked at this thoroughly. They are, very reluctant to go against the modelling they've done and the industry rules that sort of set the turnaround times and things like that because of the impact that will have on performance. So they've come up with, I think really the best compromise they can, but it is a compromise and that's recognised, and there were compromises in all sorts of areas. It's good that they've been able to respond to some of the concerns in the first round of consultation and make some improvements, but it's still not where we or anybody else wants it to be. So I think the idea of the rail map in particular is to plot how we can map out how these services are then improved in the future, and there will be specific reference to infrastructure on the route from Warrington to Liverpool and Manchester that would help facilitate that in the future, and that's something that's been worked up as part of the infrastructure plan for further investment over the next few years. So we want to use that to kind of hold the feet to the fire, to say that of everybody working on this, to say that this is not the end point, this is the starting point.
just before I ask Councillor Jones to ask you his question, I just wanted to ask you a further question based on this. I am concerned that there's an erroneous assumption in the modelling here, and I don't believe we cannot evaluate exactly where delays occur, because delays either occur in fact when the train gets to a station, or it's because of some point line, or it's because it's a curve and there's a speed limit. And I want to be confident that you've actually highlighted, you actually know exactly where the problems are occurring. I can give you a local example. We have a train that runs between Harrogate and York, and it's always late. And it's always late because of the way the timetable's done. It doesn't take into account what I believe is a speed limit area. Now, this has now been corrected, but for years we lived with that, but people thought it was a different issue. And I think we need to understand precisely what the issues are that are causing the problems.
Yeah, I think I can reassure you that, we are confident, because we've had a task force focused on this with representatives across the industry, but externally as well. They have really got under the skin of this. I think if you go back to the first consultation document, it sets out some of the analysis they've done. But I think what they've done is, in effect, what you've said, historic things. They've looked at these, and part of what they've come up with is a timetable structure that is much more robust and actually reflects, the infrastructure there and the speed limits, etc., and deals with the sort of anomalies that might have been there. And it's a much more structured timetable, repeating pattern timetable that they are confident will work better. I mean, performance modelling is not a precise art. It is part of the mix, but they have done the modelling and are confident that there's a substantial improvement in performance. But what we will be doing is, and through the Rail North Committee, is monitoring that very, very carefully. And I'm hopeful this is the first of a new style of working where we can take area by area, look at the issues and have a clear plan for the future, how we can develop services alongside infrastructure.
Thank you, David. Councillor Jones, please, your question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just wanted to ask David about the consultation that's proposed. And the way I'm coming at this is that it seems to me that in the rail industry, it becomes very complicated, the issues involved. We're talking about a timetable for December 22, and we're very good at, if you like, consulting the rail experts, but we're not very good at consulting rail passengers. So I suppose my question is this: if we're going to have proper consultation, then councillors like myself need to be able to distribute material to local friends groups and other councillors and so on, so that we can get a proper representation when it comes to responses to consultation. So I just want assurances that we try and make it as easy as possible for rail passengers to understand what's being done and what the proposals are, and for them to comment. So could you just tell me how we can all play a role in this? Because I'm as keen as anybody to make sure passengers understand what's being talked about and give them the opportunity to respond.
Yeah, I think first thing to say is this second phase of detailed consultation is being led by the train operators. That is what they normally do on the detail of it, and I think it will be more meaningful to passengers than the first phase. I mean, was open to anyone, but a lot of user groups responded to that. But this is real details of timetables. So it's what the train operators do on a normal basis, although this is a much bigger consultation. What we can say is they're going to make sure they're joined up on this. So obviously it involves a number of operators. So you will find links from the various websites, etc., linking that through. I will feed this back as well. I think the operators already have good links into all local authorities and good local links through the local managers. So they should have a good network to get it distributed out very, very quickly. So, but I will certainly pass your comments on to the train operators and make sure they tap into their local databases and all the local members.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Amelia, would you like to ask your question?
this might be a stupid question, but when we're looking at reasons for delays and where the delays are there actually efforts being made to ask the trade unions and ask the people who are working on the railways, to like the train guards and the train drivers? Because if they're on the trains every day, they're going to know where all the problems are.
Yes, I mean, my understanding is that because the task force has representatives from the train operators on, then they are obviously getting that feedback, and they normally have pretty good mechanisms for getting feedback from their staff. So they're using that intelligence. So this is not just something that's sort of being done by external consultants or even Network Rail separately. It's being done very much with the train operators. So I would hope that is happening, and I'm pretty sure that the train operators are getting that sort of feedback.
Thank you very much, David. Councillor Jones, have you asked is this a legacy hand, or do you have another question?
Apologies, legacy hand. Sorry, Chair.
That's okay. If there are no other questions, then I'd like us to perhaps note in the minutes, please feel. Oh, Councillor Salter, please.
Yeah, very quickly, thank you, Chairman. I'm just interested in the answer to that last question. I can't help but feel that there probably is a difference between engaging with drivers and the operators. Is it that no thought has been given to whether there'd be any value in getting the insight of drivers and I suppose the unions?
Yeah, Councillor Salter, I'm going to not ignore your question because my rounding up comments will deal with that one. So I'm not going to ask David to answer that one because I don't think it's necessary at this stage because of what I'm going to say now. So what I'd like to put in the minutes is that we as the Scrutiny Committee are very keen to help on any consultation and therefore and help get responses from the wider public. So we would encourage that TFN speak to the train operators and inform all council members of what's going on. Because we all have different ways of interacting with our representation, whether it's Councillor Parish with Warrington West or Councillor Jones up in Liverpool or Councillor Amelia. So that's the first point I'd like to put in. The second point is I'd like to be confident of any assumptions that are made. So, sort of if it's a straight piece of railway line, cannot possibly be causing the issues. So I want to understand that I want to be confident that we have identified all the issues as to where delays occur. And finally, I do believe that we should be ensuring that all resources, including all stakeholders, so that it includes people that work on the railway and drive the trains every day, are consulted and have had input into this process, because they, at the end of the day, are the ones that face the customers when delays occur, and B, actually know what's going on. So I just would like to put that. So unless anybody has any objections, I'd like to put those 3 points in. I would like those 3 points to go in the minutes, and hopefully it captures all the different issues that have just been raised. So if that's okay, I will wait a moment, but otherwise I'll ask Gary to put it in.
I would second what you've said. I think the point that was made by yourself in that last paragraph is exceptionally appropriate, especially given the comments of our colleague earlier. One of my colleagues on the City Council used to be a train driver. He said that sometimes the operating companies will paint a more more rosy picture that glows than the reality was, and he worked for Northern Rail. Thank you for that, Chairman. That was very good.
Thank you. Councillor Amelia, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with you, but I'd just like to clarify that it's all of the people who are working on the railway rather than just drivers. And obviously I've got a slight declaration of interest with my partner as a guard. But that's
okay, look, that's fine. I didn't specify drivers. I specified all stakeholders, and that includes everybody who works on the railway line. That comes from the cleaner right through. They all have a value, in my opinion. Thank you. I'd now like to just move us on to the next item, and I'd like us to go to item 9 before we go to item 8. And item 9 is approval of the decarbonisation strategy. I hope Peter Coles is on the call now.
Hello, Chair.
Oh, Peter, where are you? You sound like you're coming from a battlefield somewhere.
So do tell me if this isn't working. I'll try and speak as loud as possible. But yeah, we're at a conference today, and where it's actually really timely because I've just been presenting chairing a panel session on hydrogen transport, particularly for HGVs and trains, which is something perhaps I can talk about after my presentation, if that's okay. I'm here today really to talk about, give you an update on where we are with the decarbonisation strategy, and also some of the outcomes from the public consultation. If we could go to the next slide, please. We had about 240 responses, and more than the 200 target that we had. And I think bearing in mind that it's a relatively technical document and a relatively technical consultation, we were fairly happy with that level of response. And actually 140 came from members of the public. And that really reflects the level of interest and awareness, I think, within the grassroots of our communities around this topic. And our prime objectives, I guess, from the consultation, I mean, we wanted to understand the level of support and concerns around the general approach to the strategy and the trajectory, but we also wanted, perhaps more importantly, to gain a better understanding of where we go from now. How do we turn the strategy into tangible action? So we wanted to understand people's views on our suggested short-term activities, and particularly the role that TFN could play in best delivering them. Now, about 2/3 of respondents agreed or strongly agreed with our approach. About 20% didn't. In terms of support, there was a lot of acknowledgement of the need for urgent decarbonisation action, and therefore welcoming TFN taking it on and producing the first regional decarbonisation strategy for transport. There was also comments around the potential for the decarbonisation agenda in all aspects of levelling up. Concerns tended to be around where the money for decarbonisation was going to come from, the potential for the wider environmental and social impacts of decarbonisation, and also around the potential for the duplication of effort. And that wasn't just between TFN and other parties, but also between partners and between local government and national government and all the sort of plethora of other organisations that are now operating in this space. And then also some concerns around the role of TFN and our ability to drive that change and implement some of the activities that we described within the strategy itself. Next slide, please. So the strategy had proposed about 30 potential activities in the short term. Now, we know we haven't got the resources to do them all. We'd love to, but we actually asked respondents what would be their top 3 to prioritise for the urgent action. And it was quite telling. There were 4 activities that really stood out as priorities for respondents, and they gained about twice the level of support than any of the other 30 activities that we canvassed on. And they were identifying appropriate routes for rail electrification alongside Network Rail, developing and improving the regional public transport infrastructure, including MPR, developing a regional zero-emission vehicle charging infrastructure framework, developing a regional route map for transport decarbonisation. And these pie charts show respondents' views on whether TFN should take a leading or supporting role in those activities, or indeed whether they didn't feel it was an area for TFN action at all. And the sort of predominance of the teal colour indicates that on the whole there was a strong support for TFN taking a leading role across all 4. Next slide, please. So the policy analysis that we carried out when we actually prepared the strategy identified policy measures that could achieve the level of policy commitment required under our pathways, if you remember that table within the strategy. And that formed the basis of our guidance to local authorities and also the recommendations to national government. So as part of the consultation, we asked respondents their views on the relative importance of the measures that we suggested. And in terms of outcomes, well, actually, regardless of the level of government that would be responsible, responses showed most support for policies focused on modal shift, and to do that by investing in public transport networks and rebuilding public confidence in the safety and the value of public transport. They also indicated a lot of support for a focus, again, at both levels on the provision of EV charging infrastructure. And at a national level, that was really about assigning roles and responsibilities, and at a local level, having a focus on the actual charging location and things like the on-street charging issue. And the decarbonisation of public transport was also something that scored really highly in terms of being, again, a priority at both a national and local level. And national level, it was really focused on rail and the funding of the electrification and buses at a local level alongside local bus operators. And there was also another sort of common theme that became apparent in the open responses that accompanied the question that highlighted the importance of planning policy. So respondents expected national government to develop appraisal guidance that includes the full value of carbon when appraising transport projects. They then expected local government to use local spatial and transport planning policy to promote decarbonisation. So the consultation featured, sorry, could we go to the next slide, please? The consultation featured a number of open questions, and these are questions basically that allow respondents to answer in their own words. And additionally, more than half of respondents chose not to use our online question form and provided their response in an open format. And those responses were coded, and that coding was used to identify key themes and augment the responses to the closed questions where that was appropriate. And the key themes that emerged include, again, modal shift. It really stood out as the most popular. Some respondents expressed concerns around the adequacy of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the north. Another key theme was the need for more focus on freight, and road freight efficiency was brought up by many respondents. Some respondents expressed support for that shift of road freight to rail, particularly as it would also reduce congestion on roads. Generally, respondents supported the clean growth opportunities set out by TfN, although some largely public body representatives and members of the public expressed some concerns relating to hydrogen, such as the high costs of generating it and potential inefficiencies in its generation, storage and transport. Emissions from aviation, that was raised as a theme of concern. Many respondents were supportive of aviation and shipping being included in TfN's emissions baselines in the future. And many respondents were also concerned about the wider risks associated with decarbonisation measures on the ground, such as the potential to marginalise certain socioeconomic groups and also in particular rural communities. Next slide, please. So in terms of updating the strategy, what are we doing? Well, firstly, we've added more detail to provide clarification in certain areas where stakeholders felt it was needed. So recognising that many respondents brought up the need to carefully consider how our programme of investment would fit within our decarbonisation trajectory, we've provided a bit more detail around how we intend to appraise the carbon impacts of our investment programme. And we've also made a number of updates to TfN's carbon modelling tool, and that's mainly reflecting some of the different input values in relation to the sales of non-zero HGVs as a result of what we now know from the government's TDP, or the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Second sort of changes are around highlighting the priorities expressed by respondents during the consultation. So we've generally increased the emphasis on the importance of reducing vehicle mileage, and in particular through modal shift. We've also added text to acknowledge the role that rail could play in shifting longer distance car trips in particular, and also the need to shift more road freight onto rail, and we've cross-referred to the freight and logistics strategy in that respect. And thirdly, we've provided further detail on work we're committing to do in the future to fill some of the gaps that have been identified. So, for example, we've included some initial findings in relation to the NOx emissions from aviation. We've included text around the need to understand the full costs of our travel choices. That's really with the aim of initiating some further discussion on how a fairer pricing system for public transport relative to car travel could be achieved. And we've also added a couple of additional activities within Chapter 9, including undertaking a strategic embodied carbon footprint study of schemes within our investment programme up to 2033, and a new activity to work with LEPs to support SMEs in their green transitions. Next slide, please. So firstly, an apology that you've had to work with a changed version of the strategy. It's not wholly intuitive in its format, but hopefully the accompanying report provided a pretty comprehensive summary of the key changes. The next steps are to finalise our consultation analysis report and to get that strategy back from the designers, and then bring those both to Executive Board on the 11th of November and TFM Board on the 24th of November for agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I was going to say any questions, but suddenly I see two flags appear, and it was a close race. So I'm going to go to Councillor Fenton first, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Peter. Just one of the early slides, you showed the proportion of respondents who sort of disagreed or strongly disagreed with with the strategy, and summarised some of the reasons for those responses. I was wondering if you could sort of unpack a bit whether, so the extent to which the opposition was based on concerns that the strategy was not ambitious enough, or was overly ambitious and unrealistic. I suppose just to give us a sense of the scale of the challenge that we face in terms of engaging with residents about the need for action. So it'd be useful if you could unpack that a bit more for us, please.
If you could just take that one, Peter, that'd be great.
Certainly. So the consultation was self-selecting, and I think that was reflected really in that sort of the results around that 20-ish% who were not supportive, and it was fairly evenly split between those who felt it should go faster, and particularly those who perhaps pointed to some of the local targets already in place, and those are local whole economy targets, like Leeds and Wyker and so on. And then, evenly split and against those who were perhaps fairly ardently, I would say, opposed to climate change theology and decarbonisation as a whole. So it didn't really reflect any middle ground, and so I would say it was sort of the polar opposites of the scale. To be honest, Councillor Fenton, I think I was perhaps surprised by some of the level of opposition, not in terms of numbers, but the strength of feeling, and I think that tells a really strong message in terms of the getting our communities on board, empowering people, and some of the activities that we're looking at in terms of the having I think they call it the climate citizens panel that we're looking to do as well. So some really strong messages to take from it.
Thank you, Peter. One of the things that's very interesting and something that we've had to start doing in North Yorkshire and in Harrogate is that when we've done consultations, we've actually found that we've had fictitious Facebook pages raised to write anti climate change propaganda. Even our local paper managed to be duped into publishing something that was from a completely fictitious person. So one of the things I would recommend is that you, as officers, you do check the sources of your information, and it goes both ways because both sides can flower up. But location was an interesting thing. We found people that we found people from London discussing traffic problems in Harrogate. Really interesting. In that, so I think I would mark a word of caution over extreme responses. So thank you very much for that. My next questioner for you is Councillor Amelia.
Yeah, there was a mention about the electrification of rail. My understanding of that is that it could be likely to be quite expensive. Now, in the Liverpool City region, we've been pioneering battery-powered trains, so IPEMU, independently powered electrical multiple units, which will be the first in the UK. And I know from what I've heard that they're hugely environmentally beneficial, and there'll be a lot of cost savings versus third rail electrification. What consideration, if any, has been given to utilising this technology?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think it neatly segues to talk a little bit about hydrogen as well. So I think there's other benefits of electrification around reliability as well, which I won't talk to because I'm not a particular railway man. But the Network Rail's traction network decarbonisation strategy was it laid out a potential network of where it could be electrified and which routes would not be viable or financially viable from an electrification point of view. So exactly what you said, electrification is very expensive. So there's some routes where they've suggested battery electric and some for hydrogen and some where actually that future isn't certain yet. So I think one of the things that the way the decarbonisation strategy works is that we assume a level of reduction in emissions from rail. It doesn't, if you like, assign how that's done particularly. That really comes out in the activities. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're already started with facilitating through, I guess, management of and data provision into a study being championed by Durham University and Heriot-Watt University, looking at it. First and foremost, it's looking at the hydrogen refueling opportunities and coming up with a hydrogen refueling strategy for HGVs on the strategic corridors in the north. But we're actually currently looking at funding at the moment. We're really hopeful we get it to expand that study out to make it multimodal. And I think, speaking to the experts, that rail is where they see it as a real key potential for hydrogen. So it's very much in our thoughts about when we're talking about passenger rail and about what lies outside of electrification and those more sort of the routes that are more marginal in terms of the business case and how the refueling of those routes could also complement everything else we do as well in terms of HGVs and local bus networks and so on. Sorry, quite a convoluted answer, but yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much, Peter. And yes, I think we appreciate that you're just saying what has to be done. How it's done is perhaps a different is somebody else, a different expert. I have Councillor Chater now, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's one thing, well, it ties into this because one of the major issues is going to be how we don't just deal with the cities, but how we also deal with the rural areas. I represent a city, but we're surrounded by the East Riding. On the South Bank, we have the two neighbouring authorities, which have towns, but large amounts of rural. And one of the concerns I've got, if we're going to get people back into public transport, number one, we're going to need to make sure that the services that have been provided are not reduced. And that's part of the decarbonisation agenda, because if you want to get people off the road in their cars, we're going to need to find a way of making sure that people can do that. As it is, in the East Riding and on the outskirts of our city, a number of the services from the bus companies have been reduced. Not because of lack of demand, but because they can't find drivers. And we have the same problem now where rail services from December will be cut back from what's always been 2 trains an hour on this service between Hull and Scarborough back to 1 an hour for large parts of the time. Now, if we're going to be looking at decarbonisation, and if we're going to be looking at encouraging people to actually use public transport, we may need to bring back the dreaded C word, which basically is the compensation of these companies by way of subsidies to make sure that they will continue to run. And this is something that government at the centre will have to do, and it can't be put down to local authorities or to places like Transport for the North. But I do feel the compensation to make these services work is going to have to be put there. My daughter went to visit a friend of hers on the South Bank. She got a bus very easily to Barton upon Humber. She then had to get a taxi because there was no bus service from Barton upon Humber. And that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. That's not decarbonisation. That's just lack of public transport joined up because the private companies will not deliver it. And if you're going to decarbonise, you may need to have some radical thought about how you're going to operate the companies that are going to be providing it, whether it's rail or bus operators. I just make that point at this stage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'm not going to ask you to answer that one, Peter, because you're about setting what we have to do in order to decarbonise and not necessarily responsible for an appropriate bus service. I have one question, and then I'd like to sum up because we do need to progress to the major roads report in a moment. So Peter, one of the things that I see is you set a target for when we can hit net zero. But what I really would like to understand is, see, one of the things I believe is very critical around this is governance. And in particular, I'd like to be able to say, I'd like to know how many car journeys we converted to a train journey, et cetera, and how we're going to have an annual appraisal on this. How is it going to be measured at every year to say this is how well we're doing? Because I don't want to wait 5 years to find out that we've not done very well, if you know what I mean. So I'd like to just you to amplify a little bit more on governance.
So within the strategy, we've got a sort of a monitoring and evaluation framework, and we have a monitoring and evaluation framework that's in development. I believe it's going to be adopted next year. So the indicators within the decarbonisation strategy sort of plop into that. In terms of a full stock take on surface transport emissions from the north, it's a big exercise, and we're planning to do it ahead of each strategy update. Obviously, there's a reason why we need to do it ahead of time. So the next one would be happening relatively soon because we'd have to start the next strategy update in 2024. But I believe that there is a lighter version of that stock take that we are doing annually as part of the monitoring and evaluation framework, and it does include those sort of statistics. Okay, look, Peter, I could talk to you for hours about measurement and stuff. I would just ask that you use that instead of monitoring and evaluation, that you actually use the phrase governance. I think it really, monitoring is a little bit what I'll call wishy-washy, a bit for the softies, and I think governance actually says what it is, because there's not a lot of options to this net zero issue. So I would recommend that. However, I'd like to just sum up, and hopefully the committee will agree with what I've picked up. First of all, we have to actually approve your decarbonisation strategy today. So the first thing I will ask is, I'll do my comments, and then I will and ask for approval of my comments, and then I will ask for approval of the decarbonisation strategy. So my comments are that, in essence, I think we welcome the decarbonisation strategy. We have, however, pointed out that that there is the consequences of this are what will be key. So, for example, if we are going to move people on a modal shift in order to achieve our decarbonisation strategy, we have to come up with cost-effective or fairer pricing policies
for the alternative transport, and that alternative transport has to be convenient and accessible. We've heard that it's not always the case. Whilst the car remains cheaper than public transport, then it's going to be hard for you to enable, for us to enable the decarbonisation strategy. So, does the committee agree with the comments I've just made? Councillor Salter.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. Just very briefly, I'd like to still have a bit of a reference to the fact we really need to think about how rural areas can decarbonise, and I don't think we ever move away from the cars in rural areas, so I just wanted something in there. The other thing is, are we able to make the decision to approve this given it's a consultation call rather than an in-person meeting?
Yes, we are, because we make the recommendation and the Chief Executive is unlikely to do anything other than what we request. It would make his position rather difficult if he were not to follow our request. So thank you very much for your...
Okay.
So thank you very much for your comments. Councillor Parish.
I'd just reinforce, Chair, that a lot of this is unlikely to happen without subsidy of public transport. The point was made, but that probably should be reinforced in what you say.
Okay. Gary, if you could add that, and if you could also add that we appreciate there is a difference between how this policy could be enacted on a city versus a rural situation. Okay. Councillor Davison.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on that point really about the use of cars in the rural areas, because a lot of bus strategy is focused on the big cities.
That's right.
But if you take our case, North Lincolnshire, in essence, we can only get two. We don't operate the buses basically, so we have to go to contractors. We have Stagecoach, obviously we're all familiar with, and we have a local company called Hornsby's, the only two that we can get to actually supply rural bus services. Now, we give them a colossal subsidy, which they keep requesting goes up and up, just to maintain some of these routes, specifically after COVID, where you'll see a double-decker bus with one person sitting on the back. So there's an issue really about that, and obviously the cost of that to the North Lincolnshire taxpayer. The other thing is, of course, is that we also get hand-me-down buses. So we've examined our fleet of buses, and there's only about two of them that are Euro 6. So what we've got is 18-year-old hand-me-down double-deckers that Stagecoach have, renewed in places like Liverpool, probably, which are belching out.
Don't start wars on here.
It's a fact, though. It's nothing to do with Liverpool. It's just the way Stagecoach operate. But we're finding it extremely difficult. So when we look at, North Lincolnshire's decarbonisation and aiming towards net zero, we're faced with the conundrum that we can't really afford to keep paying everlasting subsidies to Stagecoach to run basically polluting buses. And at the moment, very difficult to see a way out of it. We do run DRT service, which, is very difficult to get uptake out of rural areas because people like to drive the cars in. So really and truly, in terms of true decarbonisation of rural, in this report, I'm afraid, Peter, it's not really addressed how the smaller rural areas like ours are going to actually get out of this cycle. I mean, Stagecoach and the other bus operators just say they simply can't afford to put the buses, certainly can't afford to run electric or hydrogen. The hydrogen buses are being developed, as we know. I think London are the first pilot area, and Liverpool aren't far behind, are they?
So, Councillor Davison, can I hate to hurry you up.
No, it's fine.
What is your question? It's just that we still, and this could go in the bus back better strategy as well.
Well, yeah, it's really to do with, it is focused on decarbonisation though, because obviously this has a part to play, doesn't it? Not Peter's job to look at how we provision buses, understand that, but obviously it's part of the bigger picture, isn't it, on decarbonisation. And as Councillor Chaser said, we need support from central government.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Sean. I think I've already captured that. Councillor Amelia, and you're the last questioner on this item.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in off the back of that. I think there are other options for rural areas. You can look at community transport initiatives on that side of things, or car sharing things, or electric vehicles. Like, it doesn't have to only be focusing on companies providing stuff. Like, there's other ways that you can do stuff as well.
Okay, Councillor Amelia, I think that's well founded, and we actually in North Yorkshire we have a sort of what I like loosely term an Uber bus, which is probably conflicting too many brand names, but basically it's a bus on demand. So I think we stole the idea from North Lincolnshire. So I apologise to Councillor Davison if we have stolen their idea, but we are finding it very useful. So, Peter, you had a comment to make, I think.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Yeah, just I guess two very quick points to mop some of those comments up. One of the things we have added to the strategy, and I mentioned it earlier, was this need to discuss the relative price of our travel choices, and I think this plays to everything everyone has said, really. That whilst it seems very expensive to run a bus for one or two people, and certainly from a decarbonisation point of view, that's disastrous. But the thing is that, you know, the true cost of a car journey is actually much higher than people think. And so being able to relatively look at those relative costs and then price public transport in a fairer way may be part of the solution in terms of being able to subsidise those essential services. So that's just a conversation to put out there, and I think any support around having that conversation would be welcomed. Secondly, on the rural areas point, so I agree completely, and I think it has to be one of our focuses for our activities going forward. And I mentioned this roadmap to decarbonisation, and really what that's doing is taking this to the next granular level, the strategy, and looking at the types of policy packages that we might see for different types of places in the north, and recognising there's no such thing as a typical place, then I think each real place would then be able to take what they see as fit for them from these typologies. But certainly our intention is to put the majority of effort on that in the rural scenarios, and of which there are quite a few, because we know that the urban scenarios are already well worked upon, as it were. So that came out as a priority during the consultation. It's one that we have to get our heads around, but it's certainly a priority for me going forward.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'd like to just add two more phrases into the minutes, if I may. One is that the committee notes the requirement for notes that there needs to be a review of the relative price of travel choices, and also that we need to avoid transport social exclusion, because we can either price people out of an option, and that's not appropriate. So unless anybody objects to those two things being added to the minutes there, I will now just ask if we as a committee approve of the strategy that Peter's put forward. And if there are no objections, then I think Peter, you should consider this a very good piece. Well, I think it is a very good piece of work, but also that we support you fully.
Thank you.
So thank you, Peter. I think now the man next to you, I'm not sure if he's physically next to you, but he's on next to you on my screen, is we're going to go to the major roads report now. So just before Owen speaks, Owen's going to present his paper, and then straight after that, before we enter general questions, I am going to read out a number of questions that we have received from somebody called Anthony Ray, who and I want those questions therefore to go in the minutes. I am not expecting Owen to answer them in any particular way. I do, because it's very short notice for him to receive the questions. Plus, I think, having seen some of the draft answers, we'll be here till about 3:30. But what I do want to do is I want to get the questions into the minutes, and I also want those questions perhaps to fuel some of our debate that we have on this particular topic. So over to you, Owen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And indeed, I am sat next to Peter here at the NEC in Birmingham, so hopefully there's not too much background noise. So I'm going to briefly present the report, and the purpose of this report is to inform a discussion at Scrutiny about the role of major roads and seek comments on the draft major roads report. And again, I guess an apology, we sent out both the summary report and the full report, which is a long document, but it's necessarily long in it contains a lot of detail in terms of how roads operate at the moment and the future challenges in terms of how we operate, manage and invest in our major roads in the country and indeed in the north of England. I guess just to be clear in terms of definitions, Transport for the North developed the concept of a major road network actually prior to it becoming a national concept. And in our terms, that accounts for around 7% of roads in the north of England. And they're the roads that connect the major economic centres across the north, connecting towns, cities, ports, international airports, other major destinations such as business parks, enterprise zones, etc. Clearly, it's vital that major roads integrate with local networks, and from the user perspective, whether that be a car driver, passenger, a bus passenger, they want to see a seamless journey end to end. But in terms of governance, as you will all know, National Highways, as they're now called, manage the strategic road network, which is around 2% of those major roads. And then partner local highway authorities across the north manage the further 5% of the major road network. And to put it in context, close to 70% of vehicle miles driven take place on those major roads. So, whilst local roads are vital and for local communities, the majority of travel by road takes place on the major road network. So I'm going to briefly take you through some slides. With the pack, we sent out some slides with some more detail in terms of the challenges. In terms of transport costs, actually, I'll skip over those on this presentation, but of course you've received those. This slide kind of sets out how we see Transport for the North's role in terms of informing the plans for investment and the operational management of roads across the north. I think the two most important bullet points on there are the top one, which is our role is to provide statutory advice to the Secretary of State on transport investment, and of course that includes roads. And it's also vital that we take a holistic approach to how we develop our recommendations. That's a whole systems approach, thinking about the whole network, not just the major road network. So, including rail and including how public transport uses the road network in coming up with our proposals. And that's our aim. And to achieve that, we need to work in partnership with all the North Highway authorities, with the national agencies, National Highways, Network Rail, etc., and are doing so. And of course, I mentioned freight there as well. How we move freight around the country is another critical need for our economy. How we support our businesses to access supply chains and how we get goods to people across the country. So, if we could just move on to the next slide, please, James. Some key facts, and I'm not going to take you through all of these. You can read. Extensively about the decarbonisation challenge, and road transport accounts for the vast majority of carbon emissions from surface transport, at around 95% of emissions in the north. So if we're going to tackle that difficult problem, we need to do something about road transport and how we use our roads in the future. And I think two other points to make just from this slide are that yes, we need to get more people walking and cycling for short trips. That is beneficial to health, benefits congestion in urban areas and air quality and all the kind of issues around noise as well. But in terms of reducing carbon emissions, it's beneficial but it's not going to answer the problem. We need also to look at those longer trips that generate far more emissions. How can we get them onto rail for some trips? And for those that we can't, how do we support the move to electrical or hydrogen vehicles so that they become zero emission ultimately when that power is generated in a renewable way? So again, James, if you can move on, please. We've developed the Major Roads Report in partnership with the transport and highway authorities across the north and national highways. And, you won't be surprised to see that the kind of outcomes we want to achieve for our major roads. Improve journey reliability so that people can get to work on time and be confident around that. Businesses can get their deliveries on time. Better network efficiency, and that's not just about capacity. It's about how you use the roads. Yes, we need to get more people on buses and more people to have higher occupancy in their cars. At the moment, occupancy levels average at about 1.2 people per car on the network. Resilience is an important issue, particularly with the impacts of climate change and more severe weather events. So we're supporting our partners, national highways and highway authorities in planning for the greater resilience of the network, both in terms of resilience of pieces of infrastructure, but also looking at alternative routes where you do get failures on the network. And as we all know, east-west links, both on rail and road, are particularly challenged in the north. And other areas around customer experience, and again, this extends across all modes, and we want to see greater use of digital technology to inform drivers and passengers and give them better information on making more informed choices on when they travel and how they travel, switching modes where that makes sense. We've talked extensively, though, the committee has around decarbonisation, and it goes without saying, I think, that we want to see that to happen at scale and pace, and the challenge is immense. And it applies across all modes, but particularly to road, as I've said already. And that means both trying to reduce the number of miles driven, but also getting people into electric vehicles. And you can see there the other sort of priorities around air quality and noise and support for active travel. Again, if I can move on a slide, please. So some of the challenges we face, and again, the committee's already touched on some of this. We're now back to where traffic was pre-COVID pandemic. In fact, in some areas, they're seeing more traffic than we had before. And actually, in terms of light goods vehicles, for example, we're about 5 or 6% more miles driven by light goods vehicles than pre-COVID, and we can all guess why that is with the increase in online retail. So that's a challenge. The relative cost of motoring is actually fallen in the last 10 years by around 5%, whereas the cost of bus and rail has gone up well above the inflation rate and the rise in wages. So it's not surprising that drives people into the car. The need for a sort of rapid adoption of zero emission vehicles. TfN are taking forward work right now, which we've been presenting here today at the National Exhibition Centre on how we could develop a strategy for rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure to support that rollout. And Peter's work on the decarbonisation trajectory demonstrates how rapid that needs to be if we are going to hit the trajectory we need. And then actually something that isn't often mentioned, but the cost of congestion is immense to the UK economy, around 60 billion per year, 13 pence per mile driven. And that will continue to grow if we don't do something about both reducing, if I can say, unnecessary travel by car, and where we need to, improving capacity or improving the operation of the road. Inequality, TfN has been rightly very clear about the need for sustainable and inclusive growth, and the reliance on the car and in some areas poor level of public transport service generates inequality in terms of access to jobs, training, education, and indeed services. And we need to look at investment where we can support access by road, where that is the best solution. but also, as I've said already, take a whole systems approach and look to invest in other modes if that can help people access where they need to be. The last point is kind of an elephant in the room, which must be occupying Treasury, but we've yet to see anything concrete come from the government. But the fall in revenue from fuel duty and vehicle excise duty is going to be, more than 30 billion, potentially up to 35 billion by 2040. That needs to be replaced somehow. And I think, TfN are well placed to have those conversations with government in terms of how do we move forward to a more equitable system of kind of taxation or charging for use of transport with looking at the system as a whole. So road, public transport, by road and indeed rail. I think we'll move on to the last slide. So should be one more slide. Yes, thanks, James. So just to summarise, why have we produced the Major Roads report now? Well, we've been working closely with Peter in terms of his development of the decarbonisation strategy, with Lucy, who's developing the freight strategy, and have drawn upon the work in the Strategic Transport Plan, the Northern Transport Charter itself, and the future scenarios work to update a report that we first published in 2018, sort of prior to the STP being completed. We do have that statutory requirement to work with partners such as National Highways and to advise government on priorities. As I said, we want to take that holistic whole systems approach. The next round of investment in major roads is being developed now. We're already in early engagement with National Highways on their route strategy work, which will ultimately inform the direction of travel in terms of future investment in the strategic road network. And again, committee members are probably aware that National Highways have moved a long way in recent months, publishing their net zero strategy, and indeed also a digital strategy looking at how they can better manage the roads using new digital technologies to support that whole decarbonisation agenda, but also continue to provide a quality service to people who need to use the SRN. So the Major Roads report will be used as an evidence base. It's not a new policy document. It's drawing upon TfN's STP and other strategies, but it's there to set out kind of why roads are important and the work we need to do to make sure they continue to function as an integral part of our transport network. I'll stop there for questions.
Thank you very much, Owen. That's really appreciated. So, Gary, I'm going to paraphrase these questions, but I'd like you to put the questions that we've received from Mr. Ray in full in the notes, in the minutes. And also, I know Owen is working on answers for these, so I will not be expecting to answer these questions, but I do want to just talk to them briefly, and then, as I say, they can perhaps form part of any debate we have today. So these questions are from Anthony Ray on behalf of the Environmental Transport Organisations grouping, which, according to my information, is a combination of different interested parties that are very much interested in climate change and how we're going to how we can rectify this situation that we're all extremely consciously aware of. And you'll have seen my exchange of emails with Mr. Ray, and he has clarified exactly who he represents. So he has asked some very, very important questions, so I'm going to start with these now. So his question one is, should the MMR, that's the Major Roads Report, not contain an explicit commitment to compatibility with the decarbonisation strategy as required by the TfN Strategic Transport Plan? Question two, has an analysis been undertaken that establishes whether TfN's proposed investment in increased road capacity, facilitating more traffic generation, either assists the proposed carbon reduction pathway to net zero or alternatively undermines it? Question three, how would the Major Roads report manage increased demand for road travel consistent with its preferred future travel scenario and in order to achieve its 2030 and 2050 carbon reduction targets. Question 4. Has TfN undertaken such an assessment to... question 4. TfN's strategic goal for the environment requires TfN to make best use of existing transport infrastructure before investing in new capacity. Has TfN undertaken such an assessment to see if best use is being made of the road network? Question 5. Will TfN review or ask DfT National Highways to do likewise the strategic case for all the major road report road schemes in the context of the Green Book? Question 6. What are the impacts of the major roads report investments on these other two emergencies? And the other two emergencies they're referring to are the health and also the biodiversity crisis. And why have these not been included in such within this analysis? So those are the questions, and I wanted to make sure that they are here as a matter of record. And I wanted to assure Mr. Ray and his colleagues that we do take everything seriously that they have put forward. I'd now like to open up to debate, and it looks like Councillor Amelia was first to get her hand up. So, Councillor Amelia, please.
Thanks for the report. I'm going to sound a little bit harsh, so I want to make sure that, you know, it's not directed at you. I just feel very strongly about it. I feel like there's a lot of contradictions or competing aims. So there's mentions of carbon emissions and the need to reduce, but there's also claiming a need to balance the things, and that most journeys will still be by road in 2050. I'm concerned as well that we're focusing on increasing capacity for cars rather than reducing it and shifting to a modal shift. So I don't think that net zero carbon by 2050 is anywhere near an ambitious target. And it certainly won't be achieved if we're planning and making decisions on a scenario where there's been very little shift in how journeys are made and how goods are transported. I don't think that we can achieve zero carbon emissions with a business as usual approach. I think as well, so there's mention about air quality. So how are we going to monitor and improve the air quality? So in Liverpool and in the Liverpool City region, there's areas where, because they're near to the docks and stuff like that, there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of congestion, and there's huge disparities in health outcomes for residents. So, for example, in South Sector and North Liverpool, the life expectancy is 10 years lower than in other parts of the city. So I think it's really important that we're addressing those inequalities. I think as well we need to be considering how road traffic, so for private cars and vehicles, the impact that has on public transport. So, for example, yesterday I was on the bus 30 minutes extra because it got stuck in that much traffic several times on the journey. And if we're encouraging people to use buses, they're less likely to do that if they're not reliable and they're taking that much longer because there's that much traffic. I think as well that we can't rely on electric cars. Whilst there might be a shift to them, we need to be reducing the amount of journeys that people are making as well, or reducing the need for it. So, for example, things like low traffic neighbourhoods and Liverpool neighbourhoods. So linking in public transport with developments and reducing the need for travel. Sorry, that was quite a lot of stuff.
Okay, look, thank you, Councillor Amelia. Just before I ask you to answer that, let's have a see what Councillor Salter has to ask you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I suppose it's very interesting in terms of what we've heard so far. I think personally I'm a bit more positive about the major roads report, and I don't think that we need to totally move away from car travel or work on the assumption that we necessarily have to seriously reduce the number of journeys by road, so long as there is the sufficient work to decarbonise journeys on the road. And to be honest, I also take the point that we've just heard that maybe we shouldn't pin all of our hopes on electric vehicles. I think personally I would see hydrogen vehicles as an important part of the conversation for the future. But so long as the work is done to seriously decarbonise road vehicles, I think there's a lot of positives in still looking at this sort of investment. And so there doesn't have to be a contradiction between this and the decarbonisation strategy that we've just discussed, albeit if we don't get a move on with decarbonising vehicles, there will be. I think another point I just wanted to mention very briefly, I really, I thought this was an interesting report. Something which is very rarely thought about in context of this sort of infrastructure is the impacts on flood risks of major roads. And it's one of those things that where you've got lots of tarmac, you are changing the possibility for flooding risks in the areas around, and you need to have a thought about the consequences, the drainage, all that kind of stuff. And I just sort of wanted to put that point out there. But generally, I'm probably a little bit more positive about this report.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Salter. Owen, please just hold fire and let's have a see what Councillor Davison has to ask you.
Turn my mic on. I think, yes, in terms of the report itself, I'm also supportive, although there is a conundrum really about how do we discourage people from using the car and using the train, just as a simple analogy. And obviously by improving the roads network and reducing congestion, making it much easier to get from A to B isn't actually going to drive people off the cars, is it? You know, one of the reasons that people, certainly in my working career, travelling down to London to work on the Underground as part of the tracking replacement project many years ago, I used to drive 3 times a week down the A1 and the M1 into central London quite easily. I wouldn't even try that these days, and certainly latterly any meetings in London I had would be down on the train, not just because of the congestion charge down there, but also the fact that you just physically couldn't endure the traffic problems. So there's a great incentive really in some respects not to improve the road network, to try and drive people away from the cars, but in the same breath we've got to improve it because, you know, at the end of the day we're not in that position at the moment, so we've got to look, in one hand, you know, the old adage of the more roads there are, the more cars there are, I still think still applies. So electric vehicle charging, I've seen this many times now, improving the charging network for what we expect to be a big splurge in battery vehicles. I don't see any mention of really the power generation and grid capacity to actually support that. I think without electric vehicles, we're getting worried that the lights might go out anyway. Now that we've shifted away from coal generation, we've got a little nuclear, so, you know, I think they go hand in hand. I'd like to see something about, you know, the investment in power generation to support electric vehicles. Hydrogen vehicles might come on stream. I know that quite a few manufacturers outside of Japan now are looking at fuel cells, including BMW. And we must be all familiar with what JCB and the Bamfords are doing in terms of their investment in green hydrogen and fuel cells. So they're really just observations, really. I think certainly, on the whole, a good report. Thanks.
Okay, I now need to go to Councillor Chater, please.
Thank you, Chair. We have got 2 opposing requirements for this report. In built-up areas with PTEs, there's every reason why people can be encouraged and should be encouraged to be on public transport all the time, because there's a really good network to connect them. And you look at Merseyside, Greater Manchester, South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, it's great. But then you look at a lot of the other areas, like the area that the Chair's from. It's not far from Leeds, but it doesn't have the connectivity with the other towns and villages in close proximity by public transport. I will make a declaration at this stage. I'm the chairman of the Humber Bridge Board. And one of the concerns I have is connectivity, because if we're going to try to encourage, which we will have to do, some items that are going to have to be carried by roads, by goods vehicles, and also people travelling by car. We're going to be in a situation where we need to minimise delays to minimise pollution, because one of the worst problems for pollution is static vehicles. We need to look at how we're going to manage those issues. We're already looking at how we want to try to avoid delays on the bridge, but that's something that our dear friends at the East Riding and what's now is it National Highways or whatever they're calling it, whatever the brand name is for this week, but they will need to look at how it's going to be managed, because one of the key issues that was raised back in 2006 was how do we get people from A to B, people coming from the South Bank and coming from the south of England, travelling up to the north via places like York, and therefore having to look at the networks. Now, I fully understand the need for us to look at how we manage the major networks, such as the motorways and the major A roads, such as the A1. But if we're going to avoid more major problems arising, we're going to have to give very, very serious consideration to how we manage what are A roads, but subsidiary A roads in comparison to the major ones like the A1. And I do think there's going to have to be some consideration from that. I think that if we can find ways of getting as many people as possible onto public transport, as PTEs should be rolled out into other areas to allow us to improve that network and to allow the road networks to be used to provide more buses and more subsidies, as I keep going on about. I think it's one of the ways forward, but I think it's a good report. It deals with the dichotomy we've got. But at the end of the day, that dichotomy will remain for the foreseeable future. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Owen, please see what you can make of those questions.
Yeah,
I have a question for you after these, but I will wait. But one thing I will just want to put in there is this morning I was listening to the National Grid, and they say that even if we all bought an electric car tomorrow, the grid would support us. So, and they have gone public on that. So for anybody worried about buying an electric car and not having enough electric, I can assure you that National Grid say they are up for it. So over to you, Owen.
Thank you, Chair, and obviously a lot of very good points there from members of the committee. And as always, I think the devil is in the detail in a lot of this. And as I said again previously, it is that whole systems approach that you need to take. And some solutions will work in some areas, and I think it was Councillor Chater talked about, the urban PTE areas being different to the more rural areas, and that's absolutely true. And as we would all like to see more public transport use across the north, but it is in those more urban areas where it's probably more likely to get higher opportunities for mode shift to tram, light rail, bus, etc. I think it's important to make the point, actually, which I didn't earlier. Highways are a flexible system, if you like, a flexible network, more so than rail. And we saw that through the COVID pandemic with reallocation of road space to walking, cycling, public transport. And, I'm certainly not opposed to that. I would like to see more of that where it's the right solution for that particular locality. But it needs to be based on evidence, and that evidence needs to take account of, things like, the economic need, the role of the road, the impact it has on communities in terms of noise and air quality. And Councillor Amelia was right to point to the challenges around air quality, which it is often the poorer communities that live near major roads and suffer from the consequences of that. So, with the move to electric vehicles, some of that will be mitigated, but it's not entirely solved by that either. There will still be particulate matter from roads, so we need to look at how you can minimise the impacts of that. On the sort of electric vehicle agenda, and if committee members have looked at the action plan in the report, we are actually taking forward work now, looking at the need for electric vehicle charging across the north, what the trajectories might look like in terms of the uptake of electric vehicles. Another critical area of work is how we make this inclusive, because as electric vehicles are expensive. It's the wealthier people that are going to adopt those first, and currently running them at much lower cost than a conventional petrol or diesel vehicle. So how do we in long term ensure a more equitable system across the whole network, including for car drivers. We've been working closely with the distribution network operators, so that's the grid, effectively, the people that supply our electricity, in terms of the EV work and sharing our data with them. And I think Councillor Haslam, you're right. It's not so much an overall capacity issue; it's how that capacity is managed and when the peak demands happen on the network, and indeed where the grid does need to be strengthened to support, charging of vehicles. And there's some real challenges, particularly in cities and towns where there's terraced housing or flats. How do you address that? And that's an area we haven't got an answer for at the moment, but are working with the industry to look at potential solutions. I think finally, I just wanted to come back to the future scenarios, because it's a really groundbreaking approach that TfN are taking. We're not assuming a single sort of core growth in road traffic or indeed in rail passengers. We're looking at a range of potential futures that are based on sound evidence developed with our partner authorities, but also input from leading experts on kind of looking at future uncertainty, to test our investment programme and to look at whether, does it work in terms of the decarbonisation trajectory and in terms of meeting our other objectives around economic growth and sustainability and social inclusion. How will it pan out as we move to one of those different futures? And if I could predict the future, I wouldn't be sitting here. What does the future look like in 25 years? No one really knows. But I think we need to have the tools to develop a resilient programme that performs well within that kind of range of futures. And just to conclude, I think something which has already been touched on by the committee in terms of how we charge for transport. But there are other areas around land use planning, people's willingness to share mobility, and uptake of digital connectivity that will all impact on transport, and that all is part of the whole system's approach in terms of how we get to a more sustainable transport network.
Thank you.
I hope I covered everyone's points.
I think you did, Owen. You did a good job, and nobody has questioned the quality of your report in any of the comments that have been made. Before I bring Councillor Amelia back, and without being accused of trying to get down with the kids, I actually looked at I didn't realise I didn't have to read the long report, but Appendix 3 Major Roads report. But one of the questions that I really have is, and I think this is a fundamental question, and possibly where we need to ask better questions, and that is, if I read your executive summary, you have strategic context, you have why we need roads, you have how roads support people and communities in the north, all very valid and very important pieces, but I've got to say, I am concerned that the question that's missing, and this is the one that gets me down with the kids, guys, is bear in mind that we've got to get to carbon net zero by 2050. How many vehicles can we afford to have on the roads? And once we know that question, then we can start to say out whether we need any more roads or not. And if for example, it comes out that we have to do major modal shift, that people get the bus, and I appreciate rural versus city will be very different, then we can start to talk about whether we need any more roads or not. And I just think that we're not asking. I personally think that's a question that we've missed, that we need to ask. I fully accept that we need to have. We need to have a levelling up. We have to have connectivity. We have to have services that are joined up. We have to have services that are convenient. We have to have services that are priced at an affordable price wherever the funds come from. But I really am very concerned that we are not asking the question, the real, I suppose it's the elephant in the room, which is how many cars can we really afford, whether they're electric or not?
So I can't I can't give you a single answer to that because there isn't a single answer. And Peter's had to go now, Peter Cole. But in terms of the work on decarbonisation and indeed the future scenarios, we've looked at different trajectories in terms of modal share, the switch from car to public transport, the growth or not in vehicle kilometres driven over the next 30 years. And I think we can give you an answer in terms of how we need to meet our trajectory. Of course, it depends, and you might say I would say that, but it depends on the rate of uptake of electric vehicles and where that electricity comes from. It depends on whether hydrogen does become the fuel for HGVs, and that's yet to be fully determined. But we do need to see in the short term, particularly before the fleet moves to kind of zero emission, we do need to see a reduction in miles driven in this country if we're going to be on that trajectory. And that I think that you're right to raise that point. And it's a difficult political point because a lot of those miles driven are long distance miles, and they're driven for leisure purposes. They're not necessarily commuting, which only accounts for about 20% of the distance travelled. So I guess I think what I'm saying is we have got sorry, someone's just dropped me a note and it reminded me actually, because we were looking at travel behaviour in the Netherlands, because everyone holds up the Netherlands as a paradigm of virtue because high levels of cycling, and I'm a keen cyclist actually, and I think that's good. But actually, if you look at miles driven, it's not dissimilar to the UK. There's a lot of long distance travel by car in the Netherlands. So there's no simple solution to this. But we do need to reduce miles driven, certainly before we get to kind of zero emission road transport.
So just a follow-up question before I bring Councillor Amelia in. If you were to put into your report a section on why we need less vehicles on the road, or how many more less vehicles do we need on the road, would you still be able to submit your report on the 25th of November? This is bearing in mind the challenge of scrutiny first.
I think, we need to go away. I mean, what we would be reporting is the work we've done already in the decarbonisation strategy. I'm not going to invent a new figure. It's based on the evidence we've got, and if that needs to come out more strongly in the report, we can look at that definitely. That's what we need to do. We need to look at that evidence and see what we can put into the report.
Thank you very much, Owen. Councillor Amelia.
I'm so glad that you've just mentioned where the energy comes from with electric vehicles, because that is the key thing. So they're part of the solution, but we do also have to consider that if the energy is coming from the grid, it's not clean energy unless we decarbonise the energy in the grid.
Yeah, no, I get that. But about 50% of the energy is currently green, and a lot of the car charging would be actually from overnight power of turbines, which are currently closed down because we don't have the suitable storage, and vehicles would be. However, this is not Owen's problem. So we could talk about this for hours, Councillor Amelia. So I'd like to try and sum this up. In terms of, obviously this is going to the 24th. What I personally, and I would like the committee to comment on this, I personally would like to see a section that discusses the information that's perhaps come from the decarbonisation strategy, which feeds into this as to how much road use has to change, or vehicle use has to change over the 30 years, so that perhaps that can feed into the debate over the roads. I fully accept that there's an opportunity to reallocate road space. As a youngster, I used to dream of cars that actually operated as a train. So you basically drove off your drive and you linked to the car in front, and you actually didn't pay for petrol or whatever, and I'm really old, so don't laugh at me for being petrol based. But basically you just had a train of cars across the road and then along the roads, and then you just turned off. And there's all this automation, and I think we'll have self-drive cars coming soon. So notwithstanding all that, I would like to see something around that in there that just says, well, actually, we're not building roads for cars that we won't need in future, and that's my concern. Meanwhile, you've got to balance all these other issues. So, is there anything that any other committee member would like to add to that comment? Okay, well, look, I think we've got to get to Bus Back Better, which I think is Tim, if he's still alive. I know he didn't look so good earlier, so hopefully. So thank you very much, Owen, for a very comprehensive report. And over to you, Tim.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. I'll be very, very brief because I know time is tight. And hopefully members have had the opportunity to read the report. Why don't I just say three things really quickly? First, this is very deliberately a background paper to help aid your thinking about what you think TfN should be doing to support the Bus Back Better agenda. So it sets out at a very high level really the respective roles of TfN and local transport authorities as we defined it in the Strategic Transport Plan in 2019. And it sets out the things that we are currently doing and the things that we are planning to do that we think will support this really important agenda. So that's one thing, just a bit of background to the paper. How you want to take this forward and clearly what we're really in your hands about how you want to work with us and what we can do to support the committee. It says a little bit about the Bus Back Better strategy, but you will all have a much better understanding of that, and I won't go into any of that detail. Secondly, we really want to take the opportunity to start to share some of the research that we've been doing on transport-related social exclusion. The research is still ongoing, and what we've shared is some of the early findings from an internal research strand. And we'll share the full report as soon as it's available. But I think you'll already start to see from the annex the impact of the reduction in frequency and availability of bus services and the impact that has had on TRSE. This is going to be a really important point for TfN, alongside all the other things we talked about in this meeting in terms of how we need to reset and refocus the Strategic Transport Plan now to not only think about the economic outcomes that TfN is delivering, but also the social and environmental outcomes. And then thirdly, since our last conversation, there's been quite a positive development in terms of the department approaching some national transport bodies. Actually, as in what seems to be an emerging recognition that at a regional level, the STBs can do more, and the department can be resourcing STBs to do more to support LTAs. At this point, we've been asked to put in proposals for relatively short-term activities that can support particularly LTAs outside of mayor or combined authority areas. So we don't yet know where the department are going to go, and that links back to the first conversation we had about the spending review and our budget settlement for next year. But this in itself feels like a really welcome step forward. We've had a number of very positive conversations with officers in your authorities about opportunities for TfN to help, particularly with analytics, particularly with business cases, and looking at longer distance cross-border services. So that in itself is a really good and positive step forward. And as soon as we've got confirmation of funding from DFT, we'll be able to go back to officers and start to work through those plans in more detail. But just to say, this now feels like much more of a sort of live conversation than it possibly did 2 or 3 months ago. And Chair, I'll leave it there. And as I said, this is really the opportunity for the members to discuss.
Well, it looks to me like because you're on such the graveyard shift, you might not get many questions, and I apologise for not getting through the agenda faster. You just keep asking questions. I've got one question for you, Tim, while I'm waiting to see if there's any other questions, and that is, as part of as the STB, which Neil isn't on the phone today, so we won't get I won't get shouted at for using a short form. Are we able to share the work that we've done on smart ticketing? Because in the Bus Back Better report that came out from the government, one of the things they want you to think about is smart ticketing.
I think the short answer is yes, but I also think, and I will need to go away and check, Paul, but I know that as part of the closure of the IST programme, all of that, I feel pretty confident that all that best practice and the the work that was done was fully shared with certainly with our partner authorities. But I'll take that away and confirm it if that's okay. And there does seem to be interest not only from the department but also locally in is there a coordination, a capacity building role that we can potentially facilitate to support authorities across the north, and again I think that would be a really welcome development.
Thank you very much, Tim. I have two questions. I'm going to ask the two questioners their questions and then you can come back and answer them. So first, Councillor Fenton, please.
Muted.
Sorry. Thank you for your explicit mention of support for those parts of the region that don't have a combined mayoral authority. I think that's certainly welcome, and maybe your team are having a look at all of the bus service improvement plans that I know certainly York and other local authorities have been busily putting together, and I think that might be a really useful source of information for TFN in terms of seeing where there is commonality across the patch. But no, just to thank you for that, and welcome any help we can get.
Okay, Councillor Parish, please.
I think, Chair, it's just to reiterate what's already been said, that Bus Back Better is all very well, but at the moment the viability of bus companies and routes because of driver shortage, simply because fares are too high relative to what people perceive to be the cost of private transport. Public subsidy can't be ruled out, I don't think, and how that's done with when you've got a mix of commercial companies. Warrington, we've still got our own municipal bus company, which has now got funding to change the whole fleet for electric buses. But especially with the numbers still somewhat below pre-COVID, and car travel still being the mode of choice for people, partly because they don't like sitting on public transport with people not taking mask wearing seriously. I think, and no indication yet, I don't think, what's going to replace the help to bus companies that they've been getting during COVID, what's going to replace that next year. So I think that does need quite a lot of work.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Parish. Councillor Amelia.
Yeah, I wasn't going to come in. It's only because Councillor Fenton's mentioned it. In the Liverpool City region, we submitted our BSIP to the FT last week. Would it be helpful to share with you as officers so that you can liaise with ours and help the other areas?
That's very kind. I'm not sure there's any questions there for you really, Tim, but perhaps you could just do a roll up on that and on the item. Thank you very much, Councillor Amelia.
Yep, thank you. Just to Councillor Amelia's point first, so that we're already in touch. Thank you, and I think we're due to have a conversation quite soon. And I should say just on the funding point that the sort of offer support to non-mayoral combined authorities is a DFT decision rather than something that TFN's decided to do. But I think there's a lot, particularly in the sharing of best practice and in the particularly the analytical support, that actually we can make a much broader offer right across to all authorities in the north, and that's something that we will very much look to do. I think the only thing I'd just come back to, Councillor Parish's comments, I think you're absolutely right. And I think if there's been a theme through this meeting and indeed some previous meetings of the committee, it is that because of the way that transport planning is structured, because of the way that the government operates, and things are dealt with in silos, we inevitably bring to you a set of a road strategy, a decarbonisation strategy, a freight strategy, a bus strategy, and our challenge is then about how do we join these things up. But increasingly, both the funding of transport, the subsidy of transport, and the affordability of transport, not just through the pandemic, but actually through much longer term trends, has become the sort of the missing link in all of this. And I think as TfN works towards its next strategic transport plan, and indeed as part of the business planning process that Ian talked about at the very start of this meeting, that's something that we're now starting to give some thought to, because our challenge has always been how do we break down and cut across these artificial silos and actually think about the transport system as a network. So I don't have the answer, but that's right at the forefront of our minds about is that where we need to go next in terms of our work.
Thank you very much, Tim. As a summary to that, and again, I'll ask the committee to disagree with me, that we welcome that Transport for the North is being consulted on the bus back better, and that there's the potential to share, if it's not already been shared, information on smart ticketing and any other intelligence I guess we learnt. As part of that, one of the things that comes out from the committee that is if we really want to achieve modal shift, then we have to be looking at a fairer funding situation, greater convenience and greater access. And finally, as a general comment, we need to be careful that things don't get siloed so that the road strategy doesn't get disconnected from from say the rail strategy, etc., and all the others. And I'd like to just round it up on that. One moment, Councillor Davison. I was also be very interested to see the information which is going to come in on the transport exclusion. The social exclusion of transport. I think that's going to be very interesting. Councillor Davison.
Yeah, I'm not going to regurgitate me comments on our bus problems here, but one thing I think people need to bear in mind, which is the commercial aspect that you have to deal with the likes of Stagecoach, is that a lot of people who travel on buses are concessionaries. So there is actually no revenue coming in from them. So if you, an analysis on the people that are using buses, especially in rural areas, you will find that it's concessionary fares, which isn't helping the situation. So just a comment really to bear in mind.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. North Yorkshire spends £7.5 million on concession fares every year, so we know about that. So I'd like to thank you, Tim, for that. And I now have some good news for you guys, because the last item on the agenda, in actual fact, the document we have isn't complete, and that's down to my fault and also some very late information. So I don't wish us to debate a document that won't take us any further forward than the last meeting we had. So what I am going to request is I would like 3 or 4 maximum volunteers that were prepared to meet with me and discuss the review of the scrutiny function and the future of committee meetings, so that we can actually have a paper that comes from us that can come forward to the next meeting. Councillor Amelia.
Yeah, I was just raising my hand to volunteer.
All right, thank you. That's 1 down. Okay, any other volunteers, please? Councillor Parish, thank you very much. Okay, well, we can go with that. If anybody contacts me by email, then, as I say, I only want 1 or 2 more. But I do think this is something that needs to be really seriously dealt with. And there's a number of things that are coming up, including, for example, today we had an expert and how we utilise experts. There's what's not in the paper is that we're talking about being in a budget for additional support so that we can do task and finish, that type of thing. So, and I would want to report back to the next meeting. So, Councillor Mealy, do you have another question or comment?
Yeah, just a quick question on the back of that. Obviously, because quite a few people have left the meeting or weren't here, would it be worth emailing the whole committee members?
I will get an email sent out. Thank you very much. So look, I'd like
Chair, just as much as I like the place, I'm assuming we're not expecting to go to Harrogate for the meeting.
It will be online, but we have one of the highest incidents of COVID at the moment, so I wouldn't wish that on you. So, but you are very welcome anytime, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to close the meeting. I'd like to thank you for your patience, your great questions.